Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now in our second season, and we are so excited to be able to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We are excited to continue to look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's issue on climate change, allergies, asthma, and chronic disease. Why should we care? The Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America says the science is clear. Climate change is an environmental issue and a serious threat to our public health. The evidence that human activity and expansion of that human activity is the main cause of climate change is stronger than ever. Human activities such as burning of fossil fuels like coal and oil increase the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted into the Earth's atmosphere, thus changing Earth's natural atmosphere. And according to the Center for Disease Control, climate change is and will continue to affect air pollution, vector-borne diseases, allergens, water quality, water and food supply, environmental deterioration, extreme heat, and severe weather. And all of these changes, of course, are a very, very serious threat to health. As well, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, warmer temperatures could increase the concentration of unhealthy air and water pollutants. Along with these, the environmental consequences of climate change that we cannot help but see also include heat waves, changes in precipitation, more intense storms, and of course, worsening air quality. The direct damage cost to health caused by climate change, and that's not including factors that affect health such as agriculture, water, and sanitation, is estimated to be between $2 to $4 billion per year by the year 2030. And today we're going to try and unpack some of this as it relates to the frontline health impacts of climate change, that is allergies, asthma, and chronic disease. And here today to start us off on this is Dr. Jeffrey Demain, MD. Dr. Demain is active with the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. He currently serves as vice chair of the Environmental and Occupational Disease Interest of that organization. Dr. Demain is the founder of the Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Center of Alaska. He is a clinical professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine and adjunct professor at the University of Alaska. In 2001, he founded the Asthma Allergy Foundation of America, Alaska chapter. And Dr. Demain is published in numerous peer-reviewed medical journals, and he is a review editor on several and is co-author of 2 textbooks. Welcome, Dr. Demain. We are so glad that you could join us today. You were our guest in our inaugural month of our first season, and so we're so glad that you could join us again.
Well, Bernice, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it. I look forward to this encounter with you.
So, Dr. Demain, let's begin by making sure everybody is reading from the same page. So can you talk to us about the definition or define allergies and then asthma for our listeners? Define them both clinically and then in layman's terms, like you would to some of your patients.
Well, when you talk about allergy, kind of in a clinical standpoint, what we're talking about an IgE-mediated process. So someone is making an antibody against an allergen. And that can be anything from a pollen in the air to a mold, to a dog or cat, to a food, or to a medication. So that is, by definition, what allergy is. But you can have a multitude of presentations of allergy. such as hay fever or allergic rhinitis, such as asthma, such as food allergy, atopic dermatitis, sometimes even urticaria or hives. So there's a wide variety of presentations of allergy. And when you add that up, probably as much as 25% of our population will have some type of allergic condition. And probably the most common one that we see would be allergic rhinitis, or what people commonly call hay fever, which is related to pollen sensitivities, but also can have perennial or year-round problems related to dog, cats, dust mite, etc. Asthma, on the other hand, can be both allergic or non-allergic. Approximately 3/4, or about 74%, 75% of patients with asthma do indeed have allergies as well. And allergy is definitely one of the triggers and maybe one of the primary causes of the inflammation in the lung that we see with asthma. About 25% don't have allergies at all. And there's what we call non-atopic or non-allergic. And actually, those are more challenging for us to treat. Our therapies are not as robust for that type of asthma. And oftentimes, we see that more commonly in adult onset asthma versus childhood asthma.
Talk about, again, that definition or how we explain allergies to laymen. So would you say it's when you come in contact with something that irritates your eyes, nose, or system or something like that, and it causes a reaction, typically histamine or something else? I know mine is histamine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That with allergies, it's not just as an irritant, and because if there's dust in the air, we're all going to get maybe itchy, dry eyes. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily allergy. That's the irritant. Allergy is when that particle, let it be a birch pollen, for example, or ragweed pollen in Texas, mm-hmm. you're going to mount an immediate immune response. So there's an immune activation that triggers a cell called a mast cell, and there's the release of a multitude, up to 100 different chemicals are released, and histamine is one of those chemicals, and that's what causes the tearing, the itching, the blood vessels to dilate, and it can cause swelling. I mean, that eye now can become swollen shut. So you can have a varying degree of severity. You can have anything from, again, itchy, teary eyes, and if it's a food in particular, you can even have anaphylaxis, which is life-threatening. Or if someone is stung by a honeybee and they're allergic to it, or a fire ant and they're allergic to it, that can actually result in a life-threatening reaction. So there's a wide variety of what we see. Most commonly is going to be eye, nose, respiratory symptoms when you're talking about air quality and airborne particles.
It depends on that individual's system. Because everybody coming in contact with these things will not be affected. So it's when those allergens or those substances come in contact and it affects your system, is going to react to it. Correct?
Yeah, that is such a great point. Yes. So people can be genetically predisposed or genetically built to be prone to allergy. It doesn't mean they will develop allergy. We describe what we term epigenetics. And epigenetics means why is one person going to develop allergy and one not? It has to do with what they're exposed to, the level they're exposed to. Does their mother smoke? Do they live in an urban area? Do they live in a rural area? What's their diet? What are their activity? Are they obese or not? So we look at all these factors, and all those factors play a role in determining, am I going to develop allergic disease or am I not?
And last on this before we go, and that is, I want to establish that an individual can become allergic to anything at any point in their lives. It's not like you have to be born with it, or because you were born and you don't have it, you could turn 50 years old, 60 years old, 30 years old, and then become allergic.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you have a child that is allergic to their cat, what's the chance they're going to develop asthma throughout their life? Well, that risk is about 25%. So an allergic child has a higher chance of developing asthma than not.
And I believe you told me early on that approximately 25% of our population has some type of allergy issues.
Correct. I mean, we have probably 11% of our population with asthma, for example. But when you add all the different allergies together, we're probably looking at close to 25%.
I wanted to establish that because what you just said last, too, is that we are seeing higher levels of the pollutants, the airborne pollutants in the air. We're not even talking about the particulate matter. We're talking about pollens. We're seeing higher levels, and we're seeing more potent. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there's studies, the one beautiful study out of Italy that over 27 years that showed those higher levels of pollen and more potent pollen is associated with more people developing pollen allergy. So what they demonstrated was in the levels of higher pollen season, more people develop the allergy to pollen, whereas somebody with an indoor allergen like the dust mite, no change at all over 27 years. So there is certainly some stronger evidence showing this is also increasing our risk of developing that allergy because we can develop it based on the exposure.
Exactly. Thank you so much. And we've been with Dr. Jeffrey Demain, and we're going to go to break. And we will be back after the break with Dr. Demain to tell us more about this. I think we've kind of established at this point why we should care about climate change and allergies and asthma and chronic disease. Thank you, Dr. Demain. We'll be right back with you on the other side. And we want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. For EarthX, Earth Day is every day. So join the movement, keep in touch, and add to the conversation at earthx.org. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out to find out more about the Frisco Green and Healthy Living pages that's coming soon. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on climate change, allergies, asthma, and chronic disease. And we are back with Dr. Jeffrey Demain with the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. Again, thank you so much for being with us again this year on our inaugural show month, Dr. Demain.
And congratulations, Bernice, for the success you've had and your continued expansion of your audience. It's very exciting.
We're excited, too. Now, I think we really laid the framework, and you really helped our listeners understand why they should care about climate change's impact on allergy and asthma before the break. So now let's talk about how do allergies and climate change connect or interact? What's the nexus there? How does climate change impact, affect, drive allergies?
Well, that's a good question, a very complex question, but let's kind of break it down into pieces. So one of the markers that seems to be very linearly associated with the warming planet and climate change is the increasing level of carbon dioxide, one of our primary greenhouse gases. Well, if we look at the Industrial Revolution, the level is 280. Today, our level is about 412. So in that period of time, it has increased. What we're seeing is as the CO2 rises, there's changes in plants. So the pollens become more robust. So as CO2 goes up, the plants make more and more pollen. And those studies have been done primarily with ragweed. So in fact, you can have almost a doubling of pollen level per plant in situations where you have high levels of carbon dioxide. And it also seems that the carbon dioxide level is responsible for making those pollens more allergenic. So then you have heat. So with increased heat, we're seeing longer seasons. So that tends to be associated with more so less severe winters and shorter winters, and really kind of that longer spring and the longer fall. So now we have longer seasons for people to have exposure. And then third, you mentioned pollutants, and they play a big role as well. And we'll use ozone as an example. So in the presence of heat, sunlight, and nitrogen dioxide or sulfur dioxide, you're going to have the development of ozone. Ground ozone is a respiratory irritant. So in the presence of that respiratory irritation and the presence of that pollen that's higher in levels and more intense in potency, that combination interfaces or goes together and you get a much more severe reaction. So when you put just those three factors alone together, you're looking at a higher level, higher intensity, longer season in a more vulnerable respiratory tract. So you tend to have more severe events.
We're just being assaulted here, the allergy sufferers, because I hear you saying that air pollution, i.e. ozone, which we here in, I think it's 13 North Texas counties, have been in an ozone or clean air standard non-attainment status for about 15 years. And it seems like that is putting the pollens on steroids in terms of its assault on us.
And, ozone, we've seen decreases in air pollution really throughout the world, including the United States, but we have not seen decreases in ozone. Ozone is predominantly generated through emissions associated with emissions from the transportation, whether it's buses, trucks, automobiles. So as we transition more toward non-fossil fuel burning cars, more electric cars, we might start seeing decreases in that ozone, but I think that's a lot of years away.
Amazing. But I think by driving those points home to many allergy sufferers, especially those with severe allergies and perhaps asthma, that group of people, that 25% might go out and get the electric vehicles and put a dent in that, in that transportation ozone. Yes, thank you.
Although in Texas, just like Alaska, that's, the petroleum industry is kind of a lifeblood. So, there's going to be costs, but we have to be willing to pay that price to promote better health.
Dr. Demain, though, let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing among your patients as it relates to the effect of the rapidly increasing climate change and its attendant offspring issues on their allergies. What are you seeing new, different, or of note?
Well, with these high levels of pollens that we're seeing, I've been here 25 years, and our levels of pollen have definitely gone up. Like I said, we're bouncing at or above world records every year. We're seeing more severe outcomes. We're starting to see, and not just starting, but continuing to see not just the eye and nasal symptoms related to somebody with allergy, hay fever, but also cross-reactivity with foods. So birch pollen contains a peptide called BETB1, but then you look at multiple fruits like apples, peaches, pears, cherries, and some of the tree nuts like almond, hazelnut. They have a profilin called PR10. Well, the immune system looks at those as being quite similar. So when we see high levels of birch pollen and then they have exposure to those fresh fruits and nuts, they can develop an oral allergy allergic reaction or a food allergy reaction, and it gives them about a 2% risk of a life-threatening anaphylaxis. And certainly if they're eating those things during a high birch cycle.
Just to sum that up, one of the things you are seeing is that with the increased pollen and allergens and the increased potency of it, you're seeing that it's beginning to drive food allergens.
The ones that can cross-react with the pollen. But we're also seeing more and more severe asthma. On the flip side of that, we have much more potent therapies. We use a lot of biologic therapies now, and we're doing what we call personalized medicine, meaning that we're now, you have multiple asthmatics, they don't all just have asthma. They may have 5 different kinds of asthma among those 5 people. So because we're really drilling it down and identifying what we refer to as a phenotype, then we are directing therapy specifically for that person. So although we're seeing higher levels of more severe asthma, there's also been developed more potent, more directed therapies. So we're not treating just symptoms, we're actually treating problems and turning off those adverse responses in the immune system.
I want to dig into a couple of things you just mentioned there. And I want to make sure that people understand, if you can help them connect the dots, the difference between allergies and asthma. Again, clinically, but also in layman's terms so we can understand it. And then you said you're developing biologic therapies, and explain that to us.
So for the last part, I'm not developing any of those things.
I know you're not. But
there are really smart PhDs out there that are developing these things. We're using them, and so we're using therapies that interface with the immune system to turn off these inflammatory or inflammation-driving responses. Probably the one that's been around for the longest time is Xolair or omalizumab. That's been around for 12 years. But we have a multitude: Fasenra, Nucala, which is mepolizumab, Syncare, dupilumab. I mean, there's several. Like I said, and we try to identify the right person for the right therapy.
And those therapies that you call biologic, they are interfacing with that person's immune system to alter the immune system's reaction to those pollens and environmental assaults that we usually can't do anything about.
That's correct. And that's for the management of asthma, but also the management of patients with chronic sinus disease and nasal polyps, for the management of the atopic dermatitis or eczema that can be severe and really affect people's quality of life. So there's life-changing. I mean, it's truly life-changing. It impacts everything from their social life, their work life, their ability to sleep, their overall quality.
But again, the difference between allergies and asthma, and I think all of us realize that they are related.
They are.
That people can get either of them at any time and that one can cause the other. But what is the difference between them?
Well, the asthma is really kind of an extension of allergies. A percentage of patients that are going to have environmental allergies, whether it be indoor cat, dog, dust, or pollens, a percentage of them will develop asthma. But you can also develop asthma without allergies. So about 20% will not have allergy, whereas approximately, when you're looking at the allergic patients, I would say 80% or 70% of asthmatics will indeed have allergies. So, that's going to be kind of the distinction.
Just one last thing, Dr. Demain, and that is, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to this? We are seeing we're assaulted on all sides, but what can people do?
I think the most important thing is honestly to understand what are my sensitivities. If you know what you have allergy to, then you can develop a plan. And one of the foundations of the plans we develop is to identify the allergen and then develop an environmental plan. So the environment is key. So we can guide that individual to minimize those exposures, either by whether putting filters in their home, closing windows at certain times of the day to have their exercise versus others. So I think that makes a huge difference. Then from there, we layer, different therapies, more simple therapies. And then if those don't work, then we're looking at those more aggressive biologic therapies. But the key is environmental control, because the environment is key to this condition.
Thank you so much, Dr. Demain. We have truly been made smarter, and we look forward to having you on again this year before our second anniversary, because you mentioned one of the areas, and we do a whole month or a whole show on transportation, and that drives allergies a lot. So thank you so much. We've been with Dr. Jeffrey Demain from Alaska with the Allergy and Asthma Foundation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bernice, and continued success.
Thank you. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to part 2 of today's show on climate change, allergies, asthma, and chronic disease. Why should we care? Well, chronic disease and climate change are a major public policy issue, and governments around the world are facing challenges. Scientific and observational evidence documents the adverse and potentially irreversible population health outcomes that are associated with environmental health risk attributed to climate change. In the United States, public health can be affected by disruptions of physical, biological, and ecological systems, including disturbances originating here as well as elsewhere, such as the coronavirus. Some existing health threats will intensify and new health threats will emerge, again, such as the coronavirus. Not everyone is equally at risk, however. Important considerations include age, both young and old, economic resources, and location. But eventually, everyone will be affected in some way. The health effects of these disruptions include respiratory illnesses, as we have been discussing in part one of our show with Dr. Demain, as well as cardiovascular disease, injuries, and premature deaths related to extreme weather events, changes in the prevalence and geographical distribution of food and waterborne illnesses, and other infectious diseases and threats to mental health. Here, for this segment of our show, to help us unpack some of this, is Dr. David Dyjack, PhD. David is Executive Director of the National Environmental Health Association. He's been with them since 2015, and he has a 30-year career that includes expertise in environmental health, emergency preparedness and response, public health informatics, infectious diseases, workforce development, governmental infrastructure, maternal and child health, as well as health equity and chronic disease. David is a board-certified industrial hygienist, and he has advanced degrees in public health with a doctorate from the University of Michigan and a master's from the University of Utah. And prior to the National Environmental Health Association, David most recently served as the Associate Executive Director for Programs at the National Association of County and City Health Officials. Welcome, David. We are so glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Bernice. It's great to be with you.
Now, David, I know that the National Environmental Health Association has a climate change committee and a vector control committee, which, of course, both are very relevant to our conversation today. But before we get deeper into those, can you tell us more about the National Environmental Health Association? What was the impetus for your creation? And what do you all do? And how are ordinary folks in our everyday lives impacted and better off because of the National Environmental Health Association's existence?
Well, thanks for that question, Bernice. The National Environmental Health Association, or we like to call it NEHA, was created in 1937, and it was a product of interest in promoting the profession of environmental health. And initially, it was primarily focused on governmental environmental health functions. Many of us are familiar with the American Public Health Association, but most people don't know that was created by environmental health professionals, once upon a time called sanitarians. And so environmental health is public health in the United States. We have almost 7,000 members that work in the U.S. territories and the 50 states, including Alaska, Dr. Demain. We have members in the uniformed services and in tribes as well. I'd like to say that environmental health is profoundly local, and many of our members work in local environmental health programs in all of the jurisdictions I just described. If you think about it, Bernice, environmental health touches all of us from birth until death. And I don't want to sound too bleak there, but let's just take the average person, me, for example. This morning I woke up and I yawned and I inhaled air that had been tempered and cleaned inside my house. That's environmental health. I may have used the toilet, and when I flushed it, that's environmental health. When I turned on the tap to brush my teeth, that is environmental health. When I went into the fridge to pull out a beverage to drink, that is environmental health. Bernice, should I go through the rest of my day, or do you think I think you get it. And our professional network is interested in creating conditions under which every American and every resident of this country can reach their full potential, free from recognized harm, and that includes the harm associated with climate change.
Tell us then more about your organization's work on climate change and vector control.
We have technical advisors who anchor our working committees that focus on building capacity. That capacity is of both the private and the public sector, the people I just described, to ensure that environmental health professionals know what they need to know when they need to know it to effectively prevent adverse health effects. In this case, we're looking at vector control issues, what are best practices in local communities all around this nation. And we are very focused on climate change as well, collecting data. How do local environmental health practitioners collect data? What type of data do they collect? And how do they use that for informed decision making? I like to consider us as the chief science officers of local health departments, wherever our profession serves.
So, David, though, how has the National Environmental Health Association been interacting or helping to inform local governments in this COVID pandemic?
How much time do you have?
Just give us a little bit.
Sure. So the environmental health profession has been very active in contact tracing, although we don't get I think, credit for doing that in most of the CNN and Fox News and the like. So contact tracing, we're also being asked to do things we don't normally do. For example, if there are restaurants or bars or parties where people are not practicing safe social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're not using hand hygiene, periodically, it's our profession that's asked to go break up those parties or to close down that restaurant. And so there's an element of risk associated with COVID that we normally and usually don't engage in. We're also pivoting towards the future. And let me give you an example. For those states that have restaurant grading, you know, those little ABCs that you see in the doors or the windows of restaurants, that is our profession that provides those grades. And we've toggled towards virtual inspections. And there are many states in the U.S. right now that physically don't go to the restaurants, but conduct remote inspection using emerging technology so that we don't place ourselves at risk. And if we are positive, we don't put anybody else at risk by virtue of trying to protect the dining public.
David, inasmuch as our show is targeted to ordinary people in their everyday lives, we found that it's important to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing or that we're defining things in a common context. So could you help us by breaking down what is usually meant by the term chronic disease for our listeners, and what are some of the common names of some of these chronic diseases, and how do people develop them?
This is really a profound question. I applaud you for asking it. Chronic diseases, including asthma and allergies, cause a profound financial cost on the country. It ruins, as Jeffrey mentioned earlier, people's quality of life, and frankly, is a major force behind our declining life expectancy in the United States. I mean, that's a complicated issue, but a chronic disease is defined as a condition that lasts 1 year or more, and it requires ongoing medical attention, or it limits the activities of daily living, or both. In other words, you are compromised and you need medical attention over a long period of time, just to put that in layman's terms. In the US, 6 out of 10 adults have at least one chronic disease, and 4 out of 10 have 2 or more. So this is not a trivial issue. It's a profound issue, and it's a very expensive one. And I think most heartbreaking, it's expensive at the individual level. We want everybody to reach their full potential, free from a chronic disease. And we certainly have a long way to go in the United States and, frankly, throughout the world.
Thank you for that explanation. And I think it's important that people understand chronic disease is not necessarily just someone perhaps on a walker or someone who has to have oxygen. Many of these everyday things or everyday occurrences can become chronic. And we're going to go to break shortly, after which I want to talk about the impact of climate change and other environmental issues on making some of these everyday conditions into chronic diseases.
Well, I look forward to that discussion. It certainly is relevant in a country where so many of us suffer from chronic disease, and we need to do a much better job. And I think that there are some fairly cost-effective solutions we can implement, and I'd be delighted to discuss those after the break.
We'll be back with Dr. David Dyjack with the National Environmental Health Association after the break. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. For EarthX, Earth Day is every day. So join the movement, keep in touch, and add to the conversation at earthx.org. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, Natural Grocers, Central Market, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available online for free download at nadallas.com. Check them out to find out more about the Frisco Green and Healthy Living pages coming soon. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio and part 2 of today's show on climate change, allergies, asthma, and chronic disease. And we're back with Dr. David Dyjack with the National Environmental Health Association, and he's been talking to us about chronic disease. Now, you were giving us an explanation of that. And of course, to tag on to that, my next question is, how is this being exacerbated or affected by climate change? And then which would you say are the top 3 most common or most morbid chronic diseases that are being impacted by climate change?
The 3 most common chronic diseases in the U.S., as I understand it, are heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. And climate change is what I would say adds a multiplier effect on top of those underlying conditions. It's kind of like COVID-19. As you've read in the news, the people that are most risk of dying or having serious illness are those that have underlying medical conditions. And the same analogy applies to climate change. Those vulnerable populations, those that already have pre-existing medical conditions, are at greatest risk of exacerbating those conditions due to climate. Let me give you an example. Perhaps someone has Alzheimer's or dementia. There's an extreme weather event directly related to climate change. They may not be able to mentally process what's happening in a way that perhaps somebody who's fully functioning could. So climate change did not cause that dementia. It did not cause that Alzheimer's, but certainly someone could make a poor decision during an extreme weather event that could in fact lead to their early death. So those types of situations are playing out over and over again all across the country. And regretfully, it seems like it's year round. It's not just a summertime effect. It's almost an anytime effect. I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Demain because he lives in Alaska. One of the ground zeros in climate change is Alaska. It is one of the states that has warmed the most, I think something like 4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. And the people that live there may or may not be acclimatized to that. And so they are accustomed to colder temperatures. They may be at greater risk of heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And what we do know is folks that are being exposed to heat, maybe because they are exercising or working in the yard or farming or hunting or fishing, as Dr. Demain mentioned earlier, because of the heat, their heart rates may go up, their core body temperature may increase, their sweat rate also goes up. And these are conditions that perhaps Dr. Demain, who's lived in Alaska for 25 years, is not accustomed to. And so each person is an individual, but those with chronic diseases really need to, at the individual level, ask themselves what their risk is, and entertain climate change when they make decisions about what they're going to do in their day-to-day lives. That multiplier effect I talked about earlier. Let me give you an example. During a hurricane or a massive storm in Florida, a number of Superfund sites were flooded. The chemicals from those Superfund sites, of course, followed the water column and got distributed and then settled out in people's yards, in their houses, in their basements. And so it's those subtle kinds of things that we normally don't talk about, that don't make the news, but that contamination spreads from one site to many sites. And if you've got someone with cancer, the last thing they need is to be exposed to some type of volatile organic compound or something else, a heavy metal that might be in the environment and that got displaced because of a storm. So these types of scenarios play out locally, they play out individually, but this is why it's so important that we think globally but act locally when we engage in our day-to-day lives.
Are there any illnesses that have perhaps moved into the chronic disease category recently that may have been driven there by climate change or global warming, do you think?
I don't know if there's any statistical connection. I'm unaware of a statistical connection. I don't know how well that has been studied. That's an important question. What I do know is the conditions are right. Common sense would suggest that the types of things that we've been discussing over the last hour certainly aren't helpful. And they certainly could potentially present risk, particularly to older people that may have multiple chronic disease conditions. And we certainly want to be sensitive to that. You know, what's really striking to me is that nearly half, I think about 40% of all adults in the U.S. have hypertension, and only about 25% of them are being treated. So there's a pretty significant group of adults, people my age, who may have hypertension. They're unaware of it. They are subject to a storm, a flood. We've been active in Puerto Rico, in the Virgin Islands after the 2018 hurricanes. There's story after story of the staggering distress that those people that live there have been put through. And undoubtedly, folks with undiagnosed metabolic disease will certainly be at greater risk of an early death, and that's unfortunate.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that does lead me to something that I want to make sure we talk about. And that, of course, is that, as you said, climate change can be an incredible source of stress for folks who are paying attention, as well as indirectly for many others. So can you talk to us a little bit about how does stress caused by climate change and its attendant children can impact chronic disease?
So there's a hormone called cortisol that's released to the bloodstream when people are stressed out. Imagine back when you used to commute to work, when we did those kinds of things, and there was a car accident and your usual and customary route to work was cut off. You got stressed out because your boss is a type A personality and expected you there on time. And that stress level, that cortisol, that stress cortisol, can present a risk, a coronary event risk for individuals that are prone to that. Certainly strokes are at risk because of that type of stress. And it's the chronic stress, the chronic cortisol levels associated with modern life. And then imagine if you live in California or if you live in Boulder. It's not stress for a day, it's stress for a long period of time. And it's those people that are living on the margin, that are vulnerable, that are my age and older, that have these underlying conditions that are really at risk due to this additional effect of stress in the environment caused by climate change. My own experience in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, you want to talk about stressed out populations. Those folks, what they lived through, the recovery, the rebuilding, the economic conditions associated with the economic uncertainty. And now you have COVID-19 superimposed on top of that. Much of our population is involved and relies on the hospitality industry as a form of support for themselves and their families. And all of that has been disrupted, not only by climate change, but by the pandemic. And so it's these combination of these factors that are really significant. And regretfully, we kind of isolate them in buckets. but I think we need to pour those buckets into one large vessel and look at people as one unit and not subunits of asthma, allergies, heart disease, cancer. But we are one person, and we need to make ourselves whole.
Exactly. And as I said, it's our aim with this show, too, is to try to help people to understand and internalize that climate change and all the attendant environmental issues, it's affecting us in very profound ways. It's all around us. So that, again, to care about it is not an option. It's a must. We really appreciate your help with this. One last thing, really briefly, we ask this to everybody. What can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
So around chronic disease, please consider eating more vegetables and more fruit and less processed meat. If the most single important thing, plant-based diet is good for the environment, it's good for you, and it's good for everybody. Eat local, if you could do that. Dr. Demain, I don't know how feasible that is in places like Alaska, but yeah, eat local, support your local farmers, support your local fruit stands and vegetable stands, and I think that would be an important step forward. That's something we can all do, and I encourage all of us to partake in that.
Thank you so much. You and Dr. Demain have been so helpful. And both of you all gave answers to our last question that I think is a little different, but it's very profound and pragmatic. And that is, like you're saying, eat the vegetables and do these things. It's about equipping your own immune system. And the same thing, similar what Dr. Demain said, is to look at environmental factors and attempt to control them, control the things that we can. Because many of the things that are in the environment, climate change outside of us, we can't control it immediately. But it's important that we understand its impact so that we can take those little steps that we can to control it. So thank both of you all so very much. You have made us all smarter today. We will have you both back because you are jewels and have so much to impart to our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you for the privilege.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your homes, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to see and to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. Each of these tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is Bernice Butler. Thank you again, and join us again next week for more on climate change. And listen to any of our past shows on podcast wherever you get your podcasts.